In May of 1992, North Korea saw the first ever visit of a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency. They were there to inspect two nuclear waste facilities in Yongbyon. The IAEA confirmed what was the world's worst fears, that the Kim Il-sung regime back then was reprocessing more plutonium than they were officially declaring, meaning they were diverting more and more plutonium to be made into weapons grade. The matter went all the way up to the United Nations, which voted on a resolution which condemned North Korea. The one notable absentee at that vote was China. For the last 30 years, North Korea's nuclear tests and missile launches have kept the Korean peninsula on tenterhooks. It has directly threatened the security of both South Korea and Japan. But the one country which has been an enabler, if not directly, certainly indirectly, has been China. China is North Korea's biggest trading partner. It is also thought to be the country which has the most amount of leverage with Pyongyang. But on Crux Decode, we explain how China may not mind a nuclear-enabled North Korea, how China and North Korea's interests may be aligned if Pyongyang were to build a substantial nuclear weapons arsenal, and what may the United States, Japan, and South Korea be able to offer Beijing in order to deter Pyongyang. The first ever nuclear test conducted by North Korea was 10 years after that United Nations vote in 2006. It was also 3 years after the country pulled out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Subsequently, it has had 5 other nuclear tests, including a self-proclaimed hydrogen bomb test, which happened in 2016. In the year gone by, in 2022, North Korea had as many as 65 missile launches directly threatening stability on the Korean peninsula. It brought both South Korea and Japan within its crosshairs. In his end-of-the-year address to the Military Work Conference, Kim Jong Un ordered his military to exponentially increase the country's nuclear arsenal. And for the very first time, borrowing a leaf out of Vladimir Putin's playbook, he talked about mass-producing tactical nuclear weapons. Now, tactical nuclear weapons are a ploy by Kim Jong Un to increase his military leverage against South Korea. Pyongyang has already implied that such weapons may be deployed to the front lines of the demilitarized zone. Remember, South Korea has no nuclear weapons. It also has a constitution which deters it from any first use of nukes. In this situation, where one country has no nuclear weapons and the other one does, North Korea will use its tactical nuclear weapons as a powerful tool of deterrence. Pyongyang's emphasis on tactical nukes came months after South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol took office back in May of 2022. In a bid to directly confront Yoon's hawkish overtures, Kim Jong Un activated his power-to-power principle vis-à-vis South Korea. 2022 saw the largest number of missile launches by North Korea, more than 60 of them. And this was at a time when the country was being ravaged by the COVID pandemic. Yoon Suk Yeol while he was campaigning to be president, he sought to make 2 distinct but very hawkish changes to South Korea's policy when it comes to nuclear weapons. He had talked about preemptive nuclear strikes and also stationing of US nukes on South Korean soil. South Korea is a treaty ally of the United States. It was only a matter of time before Pyongyang reacted to this, which is what North Korea did all through 2022, making it the most unstable year in inter-Korea ties. Now, the biggest concern, both in Washington and in Seoul, happens to be a 7th nuclear test by North Korea. There's been a flurry of meetings and statements, including by US President Joe Biden and South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol, requesting Chinese leader Xi Jinping to apply pressure on Pyongyang. But there is a fundamental assumption behind this which may turn out to be flawed. And that assumption is that Beijing actually does not want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. Now, it is often argued that if the United States and its allies can find just the right mix of carrot and stick, they can nudge Beijing towards putting pressure on Pyongyang. By the most conservative estimates, North Korea now has about 40 nuclear warheads and a missile that can potentially reach the American mainland. Last year, North Korea tested an intercontinental ballistic missile with a range of more than 5,000 kilometers, which can technically hit the continental United States. It is entirely plausible that China, instead of deterring, actually supports North Korea's nuclear ambitions. In China's calculation, if the North were to get nukes, then it turns both South Korea and Japan and it forces them to pursue the same objective. But it will tilt the scales away from the United States having preeminence in the region, from the United States making any security guarantees both for Japan and for South Korea. It is also likely that Seoul and Tokyo's ambitions will take much longer to be realized because of domestic opposition to nuclear weapons, as also a complicated history with nukes. And in that interim, the military balance of power will lie firmly with North Korea. Contrary to perceived analysis, Beijing may be able to live with a destabilized Korean peninsula and a North Korea which has nukes because it tilts the scales in its favor rather than against it. Otherwise, why would Beijing allow Pyongyang to acquire up to 40 nuclear warheads in a nuclear weapons program that's been going on for the better part of the last 30 years? If this were indeed a threat to Beijing, Beijing would have clamped down on day one. In China's calculation, Pyongyang getting nuclear weapons is a manageable risk which has already been factored in. China would rather bet on a friendly country which has nukes on its hand now rather than the indeterminate future risk of Tokyo and Seoul getting a nuclear weapon. It is likely not a coincidence that whenever the North ends up with provocative behavior, and that in turn results in a show of strength by Japan and South Korea, the first thing that China does is say that the use of force is unacceptable. But here's the thing. This serves the purpose both for China and North Korea. It deters the United States from using force, but at the same time, North Korea still manages to retain its nuclear weapons, and it deters Tokyo and Seoul from pursuing nuclear weapons. The United States has not attacked North Korea in decades, and it would be rather presumptuous to assume that the threat from the North is higher now that it has a nuclear deterrent, than any time in the last 30 years. With China engaging in military exercises to warn the United States away from Taiwan, it is not that far-fetched to assume that it can do the same thing with tensions on the Korean peninsula. More the tensions there are, more the incentive for the United States to stay away. More American involvement means more instability, which is provoked by North Korean action. So it's going to be a vicious cycle which suits only one player, which is China. Given its successful intercontinental ballistic missile launch last year, it is likely that Pyongyang will focus on developing a new ICBM in 2023. In the worldview of North Korea, this is the only way to maintain the regional balance of power. It's also the only way to pressurize Washington to recognize North Korea as a counterpart. Pyongyang does not want to be seen as a pariah state or as the enfant terrible of the international community. North Korea could also actively carry out Kim Jong Un's 5-year military modernization plan by developing other programs like super-large hydrogen bombs, mid- and long-range cruise missiles, and hypersonic flights.